here.
After Azerbaijan, with Turkish support, began a military offensive to retake Nagorno-Karabakh in September 2020, Russian President Vladimir Putin was silent for 10 days. Finally, he appeared in an interview with a TV channel called Russia 24 or Russia 24 on October 7, 10 days after the conflict first began. Calling the unfolding war a great tragedy, Putin reminded the viewers that a combined 4 million Armenians and Azerbaijanis live in Russia, adding that Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Nagorno-Karabakh are all territories inhabited by people who are not strangers to us. If this statement was meant to convey that Russia was worried about the conflict, it certainly achieved its goal. But perhaps more than that, Putin's primary message was that Russia, interested as it was in tranquility along its southern borders, was not going to interfere in the conflict militarily on the side of its regional ally, Armenia. It would make this much clearer further in the interview by pointing out that although Russia has treaty obligations with Armenia, both within the framework of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO, as well as a mutual treaty, these obligations have a limited scope and mandate. They can be activated if and only if Armenia itself comes under attack. Since the military operations were happening in Nagorno-Karabakh, a region internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, Russia, and by extension the CSTO, could not get directly involved, one way or another. For those in Armenia, it was a vexatious development, if not altogether catastrophic. To many observers of the region, Russia's actions, or lack thereof, were difficult to decipher, presenting as it were a giant puzzle, but it need not be so. The Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is one with which Moscow is intimately familiar. It has loomed largely in the Russian language media and general discourse since it exploded into the public consciousness in 1988. A harbinger of the rising nationalist tide across Soviet space, it accelerated the irreversible political processes that would bring down the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, for Western analysts, the fact that Putin was citing the letter of the law after Russia's annexation of the Crimea and the chaos wrought by Russian paramilitaries in Ukraine's Donetsk and Lugansk provinces, it was markedly cynical. The leader of the country that was responsible for the greatest interstate security crisis in the European continent since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the argument went, had seemingly just discovered international law. Putting aside Putin's obfuscations, many wondered what were the real reasons for Russia's reluctance to intervene. Was this hesitancy Putin's way of punishing Armenia's fiery revolutionary leader, Nikol Pashinyan, for prosecuting former Armenian President Robert Kocharyan, a rumored close friend of Putin's? Was this a retaliation for Armenia's perceived westward geopolitical reorientation? However improbable this was, given Armenia's long economic and political and military dependency on Russia. Alternatively, was this a reprise of the century-old Russo-Turkish, read Bolshevik Kemalist political dalliances that effectively carved the South Caucasus into its present form? Others wondered still whether this was a sign of Russia's growing awareness of its own limitations, meaning that its reluctance to help a friend in need was, in fact, a reluctance to spread thin militarily. After all, Russia's Syrian adventure is not exactly a cause célèbre in the country. Perhaps Putin was simply caught by surprise. The truth, as it often does, lies quite likely somewhere in the middle and contains elements of all these factors in their varying shades of gray. And one thing that can be safely argued is that far from being wholly subject to Putin's whims, Russia's engagements in the South Caucasus are not as ad hoc as they seem at first glance. The Caucasus is hardly new in the Russian imagination. As political scientist Robert Nalbandov notes in his book on Russian foreign policy, quote, "The South Caucasus has traditionally occupied a significant part in Russia's vital national interests and its identity. Caucasus had always some sort of a mysteriously romantic attraction for Russia. Its greatest poets, Pushkin, Lermontov, to name a few, wrote their best pieces here, unquote. Yet to anyone unfamiliar with South Caucasus regional conflicts or Russian foreign policy along that vector in the age of Putin, the latest Russian maneuver may indeed seem rather whimsical and desultory. Nevertheless, for those paying close attention to the region, it is anything but. True, Russia appears to lack a neat standard blueprint for tackling various conflicts on its periphery. The Abkhazian and South Ossetian conflicts were dealt with much differently, as Russia had no qualms about putting one finger on the scales and a few in the cookie jar, as it were. In those instances, Russia did not hesitate to demonstrate support for its clients. However, the fact that Russia addresses different conflicts in different ways does not necessarily mean it lacks either strategy, either a strategic vision, or the ability to execute strategy effectively. Insofar as the Nagorno conflict is concerned, far from being original or exceptional or even provocative, Putin's decision-making is rather prosaic in its cold pragmatism. In fact, it can be safely situated within the logic of the Soviet and now post-Soviet Russian views on how the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict should be resolved. As Moscow's leaders have stated frequently since the late 1980s, any solution to the conflict must be acceptable to both sides, quote unquote. The question then becomes, what is a solution or the solution acceptable to both sides? Or is this merely a diplomatic doublespeak for what is acceptable to Russia and its long-term security interests in the region? To come to a reasonable answer, a brief historical excursus into the origins of the conflict and the peace negotiations is in order. On March 1, 1988, Soviet readers woke up to yet another set of grandly trivial and inconsequential headlines from Pravda's front page. Pravda was Soviet Union's chief, was like Soviet Union's New York Times. Good photography, bad writing. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was headed to Yugoslavia. This is newspaper article, the newspaper front page of Pravda. The Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was headed to Yugoslavia. Soviet farmers were doing their utmost to contribute to the welfare of the fatherland. Yes, the economy was struggling, yet the country's economic foundations were solid. And just in case anyone wondered, the Central Committee of the Communist Party was sending its heartfelt congratulations to the newly elected Secretary General of the Communist Party of Spain. You probably wouldn't know his name, I didn't either. His name is Julia Anguita. Buried in the headlines on page 2, at the very bottom of the page, was a 4-sentence news item from the Azerbaijan industrial town of Sumgait. Here, according to the vaguely worded report, certain hooligans had done what many hooligans are wont to do. They disturbed the town's peace. According to the report, quote, on February 28 in Sumgait, Azerbaijan, SSR, a group of hooligan elements provoked riots. There have been cases of outrage and violence. Measures were taken to normalize life in the city, ensure discipline and public order. An investigation by the law enforcement organs is underway. There is nothing in this report that would make anyone to think that something is happening. If the prominence given to the report was any indication, the situation did not appear to be dire. This effort by Pravda to uphold the status quo failed, as the subsequent chain of events would demonstrate. What the editors of Pravda did not suspect, and what their readers could not imagine, was that one of the most consequential events in the history of the USSR had just taken place. What was initially thought to be a stress test of the system in the form of a minor set of localized ethnic grievances evolved into a regional interethnic crisis, and at the most inopportune of times. These grievances, managed or rather repressed for nearly 7 decades, were now shaking the very foundations of the empire, exposing its structural weaknesses and a very real policy void in the center's toolkit for addressing interethnic conflict. No amount of sloganeering would be able to contain the emergence into the open of the radicalized nationalist groups. The much vaunted Soviet Druzhba Narodov concept, Druzhba Narodov, or friendship among the peoples, was on its way to be being empirically falsified, in the process mortally wounding a geopolitical superpower. There was certainly an element of irony in all of this. Events that would destabilize the country happened not in Moscow, but in a faraway Transcaucasus town that was barely visible on the Soviet map and entirely absent in the cognitive map of Soviet citizens. Not known for anything spectacular, or for that matter, for anything in particular, Sumgait would become associated with pogroms and wanton violence, where official estimates recorded that 32 Soviet citizens, most of them ethnic Armenians, were murdered. Although unexpected, the unrest in Sumgait did not happen in a vacuum. If anything, it was the antithesis to the months-long peaceful demonstrations in neighboring Armenia and Stepanakert, the capital of the Nagorno-Karabakh autonomous oblast. There, taking advantage of Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika policies, a group of Armenian intellectuals with roots in Nagorno-Karabakh had begun a coordinated campaign to redress what they considered a historic and a historical injustice, the transfer of overwhelmingly Armenian-populated Nagorno-Karabakh under Azerbaijani jurisdiction by Stalin, soon after the Sovietization of the region. The reversal of that fateful decision was the paramount aim of the campaign. What started as the efforts of a few soon ballooned into a nationwide mobilization, with masses of Armenians pouring into the streets, forcing a response from the Kremlin. As reports of rising tensions in Nagorno-Karabakh continued apace, the Communist Party General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev addressed the working people and the peoples of Azerbaijan and Armenia. In an impassioned plea that quoted famous Armenian poet Yevgeny Charen's and Azeri poet Samad Vurgun, Gorbachev implored Armenians and Azeris to, quote, display civic maturity and restraint, to return to normal life and work, and to maintain public order, unquote. But by then it was already too late. The Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh had already upped the ante on February 20, 1988. Everything indicated that there was no turning back to their demands. On that day, the NKIO Soviet, or the leadership of the Nagorno-Karabakh, in an unprecedented move, formalized their demands by passing a resolution calling for unification with Soviet Armenia. Blindsided and enraged by the decision, Moscow displayed a swift but also almost cartoonishly Soviet reaction, where altiloquence and bombast stood in for policy. Perhaps nothing could illustrate this point better than the February 24 declaration by the CPSU Central Committee regarding the developments. This is a quote. This is the bombast of the Soviet governments, all they had to do, all they could do is bombastic speeches. After reviewing information on the events in the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Province, the CPSU Central Committee believes that the actions and demands aimed at the revision of the existing national territorial structure are at variance with the interests of the working people of the Azerbaijan and Armenian republics and harm relations between nationalities. Consistently guided by the Leninist principles of nationalities policy, the CPSU Central Committee has appealed to the patriotic and international feelings of the Armenian and Azerbaijani population. I don't know how you put two and two of them together, patriotic and internationalist. But here you are, Soviet way of fusing things. Soviet fusion cuisine. So they appeal to the feelings of the Armenian and Azerbaijani population not to succumb to provocations by nationalistic elements and to strengthen in every way the great asset of socialism, the fraternal friendship of Soviet peoples. That's unquote. Mere days after the Central Committee's declaration, violence broke out in Sumgait. The pogroms against Armenians were shocking in their brutality and led to the exodus of the town's Armenian population. The muted coverage in the Soviet press and the lack of transparent investigation would in turn raise the stakes, feeding into Armenian fears of a new genocide against their ethnic compatriots in Nagorno-Karabakh and in Azerbaijan proper. If there was any hope, however faint, to resolve the conflict by peaceful means, Sumgait shuddered that unceremoniously. More than the shock of what transpired, however, Sumgait portended that the violence as a method of conflict resolution was a useful tactic. The ghosts of the past, long thought buried, were once again haunting the land in search of new victims. Succeeding events only served to confirm these fears. The second anti-Armenian pogrom takes place in Kirovabad, the second Azerbaijani largest city, in the fall of 1988. Then the massacre of Armenians in January 1990 in the capital city of Baku, followed by the reciprocal violent expulsion of Azeris from Armenia, became the death knell of the peaceful coexistence of the two communities. In retrospect, the events of 1988 and 1990 led both Armenians and Azeris to believe that armed conflict between them was inevitable. These events also fundamentally redefined the centuries-old interethnic relational dynamics in the region. Following the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Moscow's influence over the conflict dynamics diminished as Russia turned more or less inward, seeking to solve its many domestic problems and deal with new foreign policy challenges that would account for its weakened international standing, but not for too long. If observers thought Russia was putting its backyard on the back burner, they were soon to be proven wrong. Mistaking regrouping for withdrawal, many thought that Russia would abandon the South Caucasus. But Russia was merely performing a foreign policy recalibration, one that would allow Russia to continue to project power in its near world, despite the creeping overtures of outside actors, or even because of them. And Russia was determined not to acquiesce to a second-tier status in the region. Meanwhile, the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh continued to destabilize the region and distort the internal political life of both Armenia and Azerbaijan. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of independent Armenia and Azerbaijan transformed what was a badly managed internal Soviet matter into a badly managed international one, broadening the pool of interested parties and opening the doors for the involvement of international organizations in peace negotiations and conflict settlement. Awash with deadlier weapons, abandoned to Armenia and Azerbaijan by the withdrawing Russian troops, what was once a Soviet monopoly soon became an international liability. Gone were the days of a conflict waged with angry shouts, stones, hunting rifles, giving way to the technological and destructive scope of modern war. Larger weapons brought larger body counts, among them hundreds of civilians in places like Khojaly and Barakha, where Azerbaijani and Armenian civilians respectively were killed by advancing troops. Although Azerbaijan enjoyed quantitative and qualitative advantages in terms of weaponry and personnel, he would be unable to turn these advantages into battlefield success, plagued as it was by internal political divisions. Exhausted by the cascading defeats on the ground and fearful of continued political instability and social unrest, Azerbaijan sued for a Russian brokered ceasefire in May of 1994. Although fragile, the ceasefire would largely hold for the next 2 decades, with occasional cross-border skirmishes along the line of contact throughout Nagorno-Karabakh and the Armenian-Azerbaijani border, where I also served. International mediation efforts, led chiefly by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, tried unsuccessfully to bring the conflicting parties to the table to negotiate a lasting peace. Though these efforts were successful in managing or rather freezing the conflict, a stable peace based on reciprocal concessions would remain a distant dream. In a sense, the closer the parties got to a resolution, the further it receded, bringing to mind a passage from Franz Kafka's The Castle, in which the story's protagonist, Kay, endeavors in vain to reach the eponymous castle. Quote, So he set off again, but it was a long way. The street he had taken, the main street in the village, did not lead to the castle hill. It only went close by, then veered off as if on purpose. And though it did not lead any further from the castle, it didn't get any closer either. The positions of the conflicting sides, diametric opposites since the conflict first began, only became more ossified and over time and more entrenched, a Venn diagram with a little or no overlap. Armenia, victorious in the war, maintained that any agreement that did not acknowledge the independent status of Karabakh was simply out of the question. Azerbaijan, meanwhile, insisted that its territorial integrity and sovereignty over Karabakh were non-negotiable. The emergent status quo, dubbed no war, no peace, can only be described as a slowly intensifying dynamic tension. It was only a matter of time before the tension gave way to a full-blown armed confrontation. Unhappy with the status quo and flushed with a windfall of oil revenue, Azerbaijan began amassing an impressive array of sophisticated Israeli, Turkish, and Russian weapon systems with an eye toward changing the facts on the ground. Increasingly belligerent and dismissive of Western mediators, the government of Ilham Aliyev first tested the waters in 2016 in what came to be known as the 4-day war. As a result of this rapid conflagration, Azerbaijan managed to claw back a sliver of its former territory. It was, in essence, a reconnaissance by fire initiated by Azerbaijan to test the battle readiness of its troops and streamline command and operational capabilities of its army. It was also a prelude of what was to follow in the fall of 2020. If the result of the more recent Karabakh war were anything to go by, Azerbaijan and Armenia drew qualitatively different lessons from the 2016 conflict. The 4-day skirmishes were also Azerbaijan's loudest ever disavowal of the status quo. It was no longer tenable. Accordingly, if there were no meaningful international pressure on Armenia to concede territories, Azerbaijan was willing to take matters into their own hands by fair means or foul. Despite the violence and Azerbaijan's threats to violence-based means of conflict resolution, along with the growing arms race between the two countries, international diplomatic efforts continued in the same vein as before. They consisted largely of sterile declarations and ineffectual finger-wagging, and in the best traditions of polite diplomatic equivocations, instigators would remain unnamed. In April 2018, exactly 30 years after the launch of the Karabakh movement, mass protests once again gripped Armenia, recalling the heavy days of the late 1980s. This time around, however, what the protesters were demanding redress for was not the legacy of Stalin's pen stroke, but the legacy of authoritarianism, corruption, immigration, and injustice, to quote Gaiz Minasyan, that had plagued Armenia under the leadership of Robert Kochayan and Serge Sargsyan. Led by the mercurial opposition MP Nikol Pashinyan, Armenians took to the streets in unprecedented numbers. Within days of protests, President Serge Sargsyan would resign, paving the way for snap parliamentary elections and the installation of Pashinyan as Armenia's new prime minister. The Velvet Revolution, as this change of rule in Armenia would subsequently be dubbed, I don't agree with the dubbing, but it was dubbed nonetheless, apart from changing the political climate inside Armenia, brought to power a new breed of political actors long outside the country's traditional power structures, who were keen on shaking up, albeit cautiously, Armenia's long-term foreign policy objectives. To distinguish themselves from the government of Sargsyan, whom they toppled, these new more or less Western-oriented elites claimed to derive their legitimacy not from Moscow, but from the Armenian people. A large claim, but one that seemed empirically verified by the mass protests in support of Pashinyan and the subsequent results of the snap elections that cemented their assumption to power. Although Pashinyan came to power on the promise to reform Armenia's political life and sagging economy, the result left much to be desired. Reform often meant a badly concocted mix of populist sloganeering, some democratic initiatives, and some clearly undemocratic ones, and made for TV arrests of long-feared politicians and oligarchs, which would prove popular and electrifying. Emboldened by his newfound confidence and a mandate from the people, Pashinyan subsequently set out to tackle Armenia's foreign policy elephant in the room, the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh with neighboring Azerbaijan. Looking to democratize the negotiations, Pashinyan first attempted to shake them up by insisting on bringing Nagorno-Karabakh to the negotiating table, citing the fact that he himself had not been born nor held an office in the disputed region, and therefore he could not speak on behalf of its population. Soon thereafter, Pashinyan would commit perhaps the biggest unforced diplomatic error of his career as prime minister, providing Azerbaijan and its allies, who are many, fresh grounds for a renewed diplomatic onslaught. During a speech delivered at the opening of the 2019 Pan-Armenian Games in Stepanakert, he would, with characteristic bombast, declare, "Artsakh is Armenia, period." Although he would try to play down the remarks, the reaction in Baku and from foreign diplomatic quarters were unforgiving. Next came the brief but bloody cross-border clashes in July 2020 near the Armenian villages of Moses in Tavush province. That's where I served in the 1990s. The clashes killed nearly 2,000 Armenian and Azerbaijani soldiers and high-ranking military officers, among them popular Azeri General Polat Hashimov, causing mass demonstrations in Baku with protesters demanding all-out war against Armenia. The diplomatic efforts in the wake of the skirmishes were no different from the routine, sterile, and largely featherweight declarations of the previous 2 decades. In fact, readily admitted by the negotiators themselves. The widely shared belief was that only war would finally settle the problem of the Nagorno-Karabakh. The war of fall 2020 was the actualization of this belief. It remains to be seen, however, whether the conflict is settled or whether the current iteration of the peace also has an expiration date. Given the new realities on the ground and the increasing Russian presence in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, this is a stuff of augury. So why this book? As I've said, the South Caucasus is not the center of, as you can imagine, the South Caucasus is not the center of the attention in the Western media, to say the least. The occasional coverage of the region falls largely into 2 categories: tourism, more often than not commissioned advertorials by local ministries of tourism, or war, as in the case of Georgia, South Ossetia in 2008. When it comes to the South Caucasus, quote, journalism largely consists in saying Lord Jones is dead to people who never knew Lord Jones was alive in the first place, to quote G.K. Chester. People usually do not know, or perhaps do not care, about the region until and unless something of note takes place. In general, it's something of a blessing to the Western audience when Russia is involved, in which case a ready-made geopolitical framing of the issues of concern can be pulled out of the drawer and given a new shine. Such a verdict may sound overly dolorous or unduly cynical, with apologies to those tireless journalists who risk life and limb to cover the region in times of profound crisis for little personal gain. But it may not be that far from the truth. This is another way of saying that Western journalistic interests probably match the general or even the precise contours of Western geopolitical interests in the region. Be that as it may, the Russian media's footprint in the region has been far larger and far deeper, if not more storied. The point made here does not mean that it was better, but that it was more, infinitely more, and I would say, actually, I haven't said here, but it was better too. As such, the output of Soviet and Russian journalists on the happenings in the region in general and on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in particular is a veritable mountain next to a veritable molehill. I can only hope that the book the reader is holding will prove to be a worthy Sherpa as the reader tries to climb that mountain. As I have written above, Russian knowledge of the region is vast as it is intimate. It is with this intimate familiarity in mind that Eastern Press, the publisher, has made available to specialists and general readers alike the carefully selected, translated, and edited collection of articles that have appeared in the Soviet and post-Russian media since the conflict first began. The goal of the book is to provide both the broadest and deepest context of Russian understanding of the conflict, as it has been dissected, litigated, and relitigated on the pages of Soviet and Russian press. To be sure, there is no such thing as the Russian view of the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. There are and always have been multiple views on how to settle it, depending on the political and increasingly geopolitical winds blowing in the region. Moscow has at times favored Yerevan and at times Baku, but in all circumstances, Moscow has favored Moscow. No one's surprised. When presenting such a collection, the immediate question that needs answering is, what is so special about the Soviet and Russian press coverage of the conflict? I think the importance of the Soviet and the Russian press coverage can be summed up in the words of Bernard Cecil Cohen, the late University of Wisconsin political scientist and media theorist, who wrote a very influential book on the foreign policy, American foreign policy in the press, published in 1960. And the words he uses is this, when he was talking about the Vietnam War and the American press coverage. Quote, "The press is significantly more than a purveyor of information and opinion. It may not be successful much of the time in telling people what to think, but it is stunningly successful in telling its readers what to think about. With this in mind, it is our purpose to introduce to readers the most comprehensive press coverage of the conflict, hoping the readers will learn and study the entire range of issues that Soviet and Russian commentators, analysts, and politicians consider worth examining and commenting upon. In short, what people should both think and think about." More than anything else, we envision the book to be a ready-made tool for historical, political, and social analysis for scholars and historians specializing in the late Soviet period and the South Caucasus, as well as students of nationalism and ethnic conflicts. We have divided the book in 4 parts, and all structured chronologically, that takes the reader from the first stirrings in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh to the anti-Armenian pogrom, to the emergence of the guerrilla warfare and peace negotiations and the latest war, and how the Soviets tried to manage the conflict, how the international organizations tried to manage the conflict. So at the time of this writing, the Second Armenian-Azerbaijani War, or as I call it, Nagorno-Karabakh War 2.0, is still ongoing. The war has ended, but the conflict is still ongoing. Despite Azerbaijan's and Turkey's insistence, the status of the region is no longer an issue. The truth of the matter is quite a big issue. What remains to be seen is whether it will be resolved anytime soon, and whether the envisioned solution to hark back to the Soviet leaders and to Yeltsin What remains to be seen is whether it will be resolved anytime soon, or whether the envisioned solution will be acceptable to both sides.